No.
Okay. Um, I see Rachel. If I can spotlight. Okay. Well, maybe we can suggest that people use the speaker view.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's go.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who joined us last week, and welcome to all of you who are joining us today for the first time for session 2 of Tools for Increasing Housing Production in Your Community. I'm Rachel Heller, the CEO of CHAPA, and on behalf of CHAPA and our co-sponsors, Mass Housing Partnership, Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, Ed Marchant, an EHM real estate advisor, and the law offices of Paul Haverty at Blattman, Bobrowski, Haverty, and Silverstein, I want to welcome you to session 2 of our comprehensive 3-part series on increasing housing production in your community and meeting your community's housing needs. In particular, I want to thank you for joining us the day after the election. I'm really grateful to be working with each of you as we work to foster communities where everyone has a home that they can afford in the community that they choose and where everyone can thrive. I also want to be sure to thank the CHAPA sponsors who are being recognized on the slideshow that is playing, and a big thank you to the entire CHAPA team, in particular Carol Marine, who has put a lot of work into planning this series and working with each of our speakers and really trying to deliver the content that we know people are looking for and people are asking for. CHAPA's mission is to encourage the production and preservation of homes that are affordable for households with low and moderate incomes, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. At CHAPA, we advocate for opportunity, we expand access to housing, and we develop the affordable housing field through trainings. With the Tools Conference, we are doing all three. We're highlighting opportunities within our communities, offering approaches to expanding access to housing and development. And we are working to develop the field by providing this platform for statewide experts to share their expertise with you. As of 2021, CHAPA and our partners have really been energized by the new housing tools that came with the housing choice law, lowering the voting threshold to make rezoning for more homes at the local level, to make that possible, along with the MBTA Communities Act, which many of you have passed in your communities or are working towards that right now, and along with the new ability for judges to require abutters to post bonds in challenges to affordable housing developments. And that was really meant to reduce frivolous lawsuits and encourage production of the homes that we need. And of course, most recently, we have the Affordable Homes Act. So we have a whole new set of tools that really combined with our tried and true policies and programs here in Massachusetts, give us so much opportunity at the local level to put them to good use. The tools that we've had for so long that so many of you have been using, Chapter 40R, our smart growth tool, Chapter 40B, the landmark affordable housing law in Massachusetts that's responsible for most of the multifamily production outside of our major cities. And of course, Chapter 40T, the strongest housing preservation law in the country. So we are really grateful for the work that each of you has done to help to develop these policies and now to have the opportunity to really put them to work. Today's session will approach housing production with a fair housing lens, how communities are working to identify and address exclusionary policies to ensure that every person, every family, every household has the opportunity to live in a welcoming community of their choice. My colleague, Whitney Demetrius, Director of Fair Housing and Municipal Engagement, will lead the panel, and she will be joined by experts from the private sector and the Office of the Attorney General. Before our panel joins us, we are pleased to present a terrific keynote speaker to open the session with an insider's understanding of our newest tool, the 49 policies and many funding programs in the Affordable Homes Act. The keynote will be offered by my friend and former colleague, Eric Shupin, Chief of Policy at the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. Eric and I have been working as partners in affordable housing for more than 10 years. And many of you know that before Eric joined the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, he was the Director of Public Policy here at CHAPA. Eric is passionate about advancing equitable and inclusive solutions to create welcoming communities for all. Eric is going to spend some time today sharing his insights into the opportunities that are available now, will become available to communities as the Affordable Homes Act is implemented. We are so pleased to welcome Eric to guide us through this great new tool. So please join me, put your Zoom hands together and welcome Eric Shupin.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I truly appreciate it. On behalf of Secretary Gustis and the Healy Driscoll administration, thank you for the work that CHAPA does. I can truly say I am so glad to be gathered here today with all of you this afternoon, because this feels like a safe space for me. It's a homecoming of sorts, and there really is. There are no other people I'd rather be spending it with right now. That does not mean to say that this is an easy afternoon to be anywhere, but there is no community I'd rather be with, because this community, our housing community, is strong, and I'm fortunate to be part of it and to take strength from it. And we all need to remember that strength. There are days like today that I have to look to the stories of those who have overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, the activists and advocates who fought for justice despite immense opposition. And their journeys remind me every day that adversity can and must be overcome to allow us to achieve the extraordinary. I've worked in this space, as you mentioned, Rachel, in Massachusetts for over a decade now, and I've been inspired by your stories so many times. As housers, we fight for more affordable, safe, and healthy homes every single day in our communities and at every level of government, and that fight will continue. I remember the first meeting after the global pandemic outbreak, when hundreds of people in our community joined together to ask, what can we do to help? And then you all helped to pass the strongest eviction moratorium in the nation. I've watched as many of you have stood up in your communities to say yes for more housing, even in face of fierce opposition from your neighbors. I've witnessed a community after community pass zoning to undo exclusionary practices that have kept too many people out for too long. And so I just want to share that I'm constantly inspired and constantly reminded of your strength. And so as we are here today showing up for justice, the work continues. And so I want to say thank you. I see you. I appreciate you. And now let's get to work. And in that spirit, I'm here today to talk about the work we're doing in Massachusetts through the Affordable Homes Act and everything we're doing to address our housing challenges. I'm not going to be able to cover everything because I only have a limited amount of time and there's so much to talk about, but I'm going to hit on some highlights on capital funding, the Office of Fair Housing, accessory dwelling units, abutter appeal, state-owned land, state housing, the state housing plan coming out, commissions we're going to be putting into place. And those are just a few of that's, again, that's not even everything. So let's dive right in and get to work. As you all know, the governor signed the Affordable Homes Act with the $5.16 billion authorization for affordable housing, public housing, and community development programs. Now, as folks know, passing a bond authorization is just the first step in accessing these resources, including in the bill. The authorizations must be appropriated through the annual capital investment plan put out by the governor each summer. The authorizations in the Affordable Homes Act will be available as the governor plans her next capital budget due for release in 2025 or in June of 2025. Of course, it's rare for the full authorization in any given bond bill to be used, but we will work hard to build in as much as possible for housing through the next capital budget. And of course, would ask for your help in advocating for that. Even without the authorizations of the Affordable Homes Act, the governor has demonstrated her commitment to housing in her previous capital budgets. With housing development a top priority of this administration, the governor's already provided record levels of capital funding for housing, increasing the investment capacity of EOHLC by nearly 30% in FY25 and over 50% over the past 2 years for programs that we know will make a difference. The Affordable Homes Act will provide us the opportunity to do even more in the FY26 capital budget, not only to support the tried and true programs that already exist, like the state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which received a doubling of its authorization from $400 to $800 million, but the bill provides us the opportunity to try new and innovative strategies to produce affordable and mixed income housing developments and other market transformation activities. This can include the reuse of commercial space and office space and underutilized state land or assets, including brownfields or grayfield sites. The Affordable Homes Act allows us to look at how to support modular construction and manufactured housing and other innovative housing models that offer development or other cost savings using advanced technologies and providing efficiencies to accelerate production and incorporate energy efficiency or energy conservation into their design. It also allows us to think about how to best support accessory dwelling units and co-housing models and other, again, market transformation efforts such as mixed income social housing pilot program, where a local or regional housing authority or other public, quasi-public entity develops and maintains new housing under that social housing program. The Affordable Homes Act is also committed to supporting housing across all incomes in Massachusetts, creating both rental and homeownership opportunities. For homeownership, the bill ensures that resources will remain available for the Commonwealth Builder Program, which creates homeownership opportunities in gateway cities. It will also ensure that additional resources will be made available for MassDreams, providing down payment and other assistance for first-time homebuyers. Finally, on homeownership, the Affordable Homes Act creates an entirely new tool for creating these opportunities, the Homeownership Production Tax Credit, which Mass Housing is helping to develop right now. This will act like the state's low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC, when it comes to building homes, but it will support new homeownership opportunities instead of rental homes. Given all this, our housing development team, our livable communities team as well, working alongside our quasi-state agencies, Mass Housing, Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and CDAC, will be busy getting these resources out through multiple funding rounds throughout the year. So I hope you stay tuned from us as we work to, again, incorporate these resources into our capital budget, put together some of these new programs, and then get them out through our annual funding rounds. So the Affordable Homes Act is not just about having more resources for housing. The law is also about how we are using those resources to increase access to housing choice and making more equitable communities through affirmatively furthering fair housing. The Affordable Homes Act directs the Secretary for the first time to create an Office of Fair Housing and appoint a director of this office. The office will work across all of EOHLC's divisions, as well as other state agencies, to develop policies and strategies that advance the elimination of housing discrimination and increase access to fair housing. It will help overcome patterns of segregation, foster inclusive communities without barriers that restrict access for individuals or groups protected from unlawful practices under our state's anti-discrimination law, Chapter 151B. And it will help support enforcement and compliance with all of federal and state fair housing laws, something that we know will be very important in the weeks, months, and years to come. The office will develop initiatives to address the social and economic determinants of housing disparities, and it will also administer the Fair Housing Fund. This will help support private enforcement initiatives, education and outreach, fair housing testing, and other efforts to affirmatively further fair housing. These funds will be made available for Fair Housing Assistance Programs, FIPS, Fair Housing Initiative Programs, FAPS, nonprofits, local housing authorities, and others. I'm excited to share that I think the Secretary mentioned that last week we were preparing a post for the job position for the Director of Fair Housing. And as of, yesterday was Tuesday. As of yesterday, we do have a job posted for a Director of Fair Housing. It will be the first state director of fair housing that we have, and so a very exciting opportunity that we absolutely want strong candidates for. Once I'm done with these remarks, I can share the link, and I hope that you'll help spread the word about this exciting opportunity and come work with me at EOHLC. I do want to point out that the Fair Housing Fund, which is created in the Affordable Homes Act, is not actually funded yet. And so I look forward to working with all of you to help identify a funding source to get these resources out on the street to our communities doing this important work. Moving now to, so that's fair housing, moving to some of the other policies. As you know, the Affordable Homes Act made these changes to create more housing in communities. Rachel mentioned the dozens. There are 49 different policy provisions that we've counted. And probably the policy that's getting the most attention is allowing moderately sized ADUs anywhere that's zoned for single family housing by right in Massachusetts. Outside of Boston, as Boston has their own zoning code, but this is under Chapter 48. These ADUs can exist within existing primary residence, like converting a basement into an apartment, and an attachment to a primary residence, like adding a new construction addition, or a completely detached structure, like a cottage or converted detached garage in a backyard. ADUs can be part of the solution to create enough housing for people at all income levels and stages of life. This will enable the gradual addition of new homes with our goal of 8,000 to 10,000 new ADUs in the next 5 years. Many municipalities already have ADU zoning in place with various types of restrictions that have seen limited new units. EOHLC's goal is to foster collaboration to have the right zoning in place, interested and informed property owners, supportive financing, and builders ready to go so that we can hit our goals of creating 8,000 to 10,000 new ADUs soon. While the new law allows municipalities to put in place reasonable regulations such as site plan review and restrictions on short-term rentals, a community cannot unreasonably restrict ADUs. This includes prohibiting owner occupancy restrictions or requiring more than one parking spot per ADU or any additional parking if within a half mile of a commuter rail, subway or bus station, or ferry terminal. We know that there is a lot of interest in ADUs. On Monday, and I see Esme is here, on Monday, we held, along with the Attorney General's office, the first of a series of webinars to get feedback from municipalities, planners, and other municipal staff, where over 850 people attended this first webinar to learn more. The goal I can share that the administration is committed to having regulations and guidance in place on the effective date of February 2nd, 2025. That's when the Affordable Homes Act will make the ADU provision, it goes into effect. Now, what this means is that there's going to be a very tight turnaround time for the formal regulation promulgation process. So we're going to need your input and feedback likely over this holiday season. I know it will be a busy time, but a really important time to engage with us as we draft a regulation and guidance, go through a public comment period, and host a public hearing, all in a reasonably short amount of time. We are working now to draft regulations, including looking at key definitions, like what is a reasonable restriction could mean and how to collect data and report on ADUs as we do this. We're also continuing to develop guidance, including updating EOHLC's FAQ document and possibly developing model bylaws. We're thinking about the resources needed for property owners and information on financing funding and other things needed for ADU construction. We're even looking to create a design competition to make it as easy as possible for when homeowners want to build an ADU. We know that there are going to be a lot of questions about this, and EOHLC, as I said, is working hard to develop and continue updating FAQs that we have on our website right now. You can stay informed of progress on implementation and ask questions and get access to these FAQs at mass.gov/ADU. Another policy passed in the Affordable Homes Act and already in place is there abutter appeals reforms that will help move forward housing and keep housing production on pace. The law makes it much more difficult for abutters to challenge local zoning permits granted to developers, something we know housing developments face far too often, with abutters often filing an appeal, not really for a purpose of real concern, but just for the purpose of holding up a project until a developer just says enough and walks away. Rachel mentioned that abutter appeals reforms passed a few years ago, and they've been updated to make it an even stronger law. Under the prior law, an abutter to a building project could tie up and delay construction by filing an appeal or a special permit, variance, or site plan approval. While the right of the abutter to appeal this zoning permit in court still exists, the Affordable Homes Act raises the bar and makes an appeal more difficult. Now, to bring an appeal, the abutter's complaint must allege a plausible and measurable injury that's unique to the abutter without just claiming that they're an abutter and that alone gives them standing. The Affordable Homes Act also imposes what's likely to be a greater deterrent for abutters to appeal zoning permits by giving judges greater authority to require a bond to move forward on that appeal. Under the old law, a judge could order a bond of up to $50,000. Now that amount has gone up to $250,000. And a judge can order the abutter to post that bond, and the requirement to show bad faith or malice no longer exists. In addition, the judge can now order the abutter to pay the developer's attorney's fees if the judge finds the appeal was brought in bad faith or with malice. This change will most certainly serve to discourage many abutters and other affected parties from filing appeals of zoning permit just for the purpose of slowing down the development. It will still allow these meritorious appeals to move forward, but hopefully we will see less dilatory tactics to our housing developments. In addition to looking at what we can do with ADUs, abutter appeals, the administration is also looking at how we can better use our own state-owned land and public land for housing. The governor directed her administration, when she filed the Affordable Homes Act, back in October, she also filed an executive order directing her administration to identify state-owned sites not currently being used or that are marked as surplus, that are underutilized or have more land needed to meet their intended use, and evaluate if those sites might be a good location for housing development. The administration is currently working to identify these potential sites and make this list publicly available. We've made a lot of progress over the last year, and we look forward to hopefully getting that out publicly in the coming months. While this exercise took place under the executive order, the Affordable Homes Act also eased the burdensome process of disposing of this land for housing purposes. The Affordable Homes Act removed the requirement to offer the land to state and municipal authorities before disposition and the need for a home rule petition when disposing of these properties for housing purposes. We expect that this can save 1 to 2 years of time off of the disposal process, depending upon the property. The Affordable Homes Act temporary streamlined process for surplus property from state agencies also include public higher education institutions, public agencies, and other public agencies such as UMass Building Authority, the MBTA, and MassDOT, again, for the purpose of disposing of land for housing. And of note, the thing that I'm excited about, properties that go through this streamlined process may be developed as of right at not less than 4 units per acre, subject to reasonable restrictions, such as bulk and height structures and determining yard sizes, lot area, and setbacks. But that's regardless of existing zoning. So in identifying the sites that are surplus, easing the disposition process itself, and allowing them to be used by right for housing, we really think that this is a way that's going to be able to get our state-owned land into good use for housing. And again, I look forward to sharing more about that in the coming months. Even with all of this, we know we have so much more to do. And that's why we're developing the first statewide housing plan in over 40 years. This plan will include a housing needs assessment that leverages key supply and demographic data to analyze our housing insufficiencies by each region across the state and set goals. This plan will identify our future housing needs by region, what types of housing we need to accommodate our diverse communities, and the levels of affordability we need to make Massachusetts affordable and competitive. The plan will outline strategies for housing production and growth and highlight how we are going to implement, fund, and build more housing to meet those goals. The plan is being guided by the Housing Advisory Council, a group of housing experts from across Massachusetts. And I want to give a special shout out to Rachel from CHAPA for her work serving on the Housing Advisory Council. And of course, her insights and recommendations have been invaluable to the process. We expect to release this plan shortly after the new year, and it will be the first plan of many, because the Affordable Homes Act now requires that the state prepare a housing plan every 5 years. Just like we produce an economic development plan every 4 years that then helps inform a package of policy proposal and legislation, hopefully so too will this state housing plan and coincide also with the filing of, say, a housing bond bill that needs to happen every 5 years as well. In addition to this, we know that we're not done between the state housing plan and everything else in the Affordable Homes Act. And that's why EOHLC looks forward to bringing together in the new year 3 commissions created by the Affordable Homes Act: a commission on senior housing, on accessible housing, and on housing for on those with extremely low incomes. Our work is not finished, and we recognize that. We could not get everything done in just one bill in the Affordable Homes Act. And that's why we want to take the time to look at those specific areas around ELI housing, seniors, and persons with disabilities, and come up with additional policies, recommendations, and resources that are needed to meet our housing needs for those populations. And that work will be done over the next 6 months because though it's a tight deadline, I think it's good to have. Their work is scheduled to be done according to the Affordable Homes Act in June of 2025. Again, something that stay tuned in the new year. You will see these commissions getting up and running, and some of you may even be participating on them. But we'll also make sure to let everyone know about their progress and how you can participate to share ideas on those issues. I hope that all of this shows the extent to which Governor Healy, Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, Secretary Augustus, and the entire team at EOHLC is working hard to address the housing challenges we face. It is truly my privilege every day to work with all of you and my entire team here at EOHLC. Smart, dedicated, compassionate, empathetic people working to make our community stronger and more welcoming. There can be beyond difficult days, but there is no community that I would rather face these challenges with. So I again just will end by saying thank you. I look forward to continuing to work with you, and let's get this done to make Massachusetts an even better place to live, both for our current residents and all our future residents. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Eric. It is inspiring to hear you speak. Appreciate you so much. A true housing champion. We see your fingerprints all over the Affordable Housing Act, and just really appreciate to have you as both a partner and friend in this work. And also to uplift the real champion of both the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities and the Healy administration for your commitment, right, to really putting housing at the forefront. I am excited. It is my real pleasure to be convening this conversation today and moderating this discussion. I'm Whitney Demetrius. I'm the Director of Fair Housing and Municipal Engagement here at CHAPA. And again, I want to appreciate everyone for joining us today, right? You could be anywhere, but you're here with us. And as Eric has said, he sort of laid out this hopeful roadmap for us, showing up for justice today, right? As he said, and understanding that, as David Harris often says, fair housing is fair justice, right? And so really leaning into this moment that there's more to do and getting to work. And so excited to be part of the conversation on today, right? Leaning in on some productive energy and a path forward to advance fair housing and explore the tools, right? Both in the Affordable Homes Act and all the tools that we have at our disposal, right, around housing production in our Commonwealth to ensure this duty, right, to affirmatively further fair housing and ensuring that people have a place they can call home free from housing discrimination. I think on the first kickoff day, the keynote, Secretary Ed Augustus mentioned that, the Affordable Homes Act sort of emphasizing its success and seeing it as a tool, undoing decades of no, right? Undoing decades of no. And so certainly want to lean in today with our discussion to talk about fair housing now and fair housing in terms of what it can be, and hearing from our esteemed panelists. Each presenter will speak for about 10 minutes or so. So please use your questions and feel free to put your questions in the chat. We will convene everyone back together and have a time where I will have guided questions and then open it up to the audience. We'll be hearing from Elizabeth Rust, the Director of the Regional Housing Services Office, Esme Caramello, the Director of Housing Affordability Unit, the Office of the Attorney General, who has a huge background in fair housing and also teaches at Harvard Law. And I just want to take a moment too to applaud the Attorney General Campbell, for continuing to put affordability and fair housing at the forefront of her agenda and establishment of this new unit. So excited to be hearing from Esme. And then lastly, Matt Rabanya, who is the principal from Boston Communities, and having a developer voice. So I'm really, really excited for the panel presentations and PowerPoints will be available following today's discussion. So don't feel free to not have to take everything down, but you'll be able to have that at your disposal. And full bios of all of our panelists are available on our CHAPA events page. And I think I see my colleague just placed a link. So feel free to jump back and look at this, the deep background and expertise of our esteemed panelists. So it is my pleasure to turn it over first to Liz. She'll be opening us up here, sort of exposing exclusionary practices and policies that persist in our community around source of income and families with children and steering and 40B and 40R and really that disconnect of voucher holders and production. So I'm really excited to turn it over to Liz, who also been doing some testing work. Excited to hear some of the housing discrimination testing that you have been uncovering as well. So I'll give the floor to you and excited for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. Yeah, hi, I'm Liz Rust. I'm the director of the Regional Housing Services Office, and I'm very honored to be with you this afternoon. I was last week honored to be invited, and I'm especially honored to be here on this particular day with each of you. You know, I look through the participants and I'm really bolstered by the energy towards the work ahead from the people who are here today. You are the answer. You are the huge part of the answer. Make no mistake about that. The energy and the commitment and the dedication and the power for good and the power for justice that is in all of you in this participation, the participant role here, and led by all the great work that Eric talked about is fabulous. So quite on the other side of that spectrum, I'm here to talk about, I call it in the arena, right? So to steal the Tom Brady phrase, in the arena. So that's what I do. I take all those administrative policies and I am out in there, and we can go to the next slide. And sometimes that's what I feel like. There I am, right in the arena, you know, fighting the good fight. It's not the critic who counts, and the credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, right? That's really where it all happens. It's very easy, as we all know, to sit back and to talk about what's wrong. It should be this way. It could be more perfect. It could be a better site. It could be this. It could be that. What's wrong with the picture? But to actually take the pieces and try to make it work towards what we have is really the challenge. So next slide. So this is just a little bit about us, the Regional Housing Services Office. So we are a municipal collaboration of 10 communities in the Metro West. Now we're in probably like year 14 it is here. So we can have here the 10 communities there. And we do a variety of things. We administer many programs, the home program. We do a lot of 40B work. We do monitoring work where we are one of the monitoring agents for mass housing. We do a lot of lottery work. We've done hundreds of lotteries for new construction. We've qualified probably a couple of thousand applicants. So we're very versed in resident selection. And all aspects of the 40B type programs, the LIP, LAU, and those kind of programs. So next. So this isn't really intended to not be a defeatist slide by any stretch, but just to recognize the challenges that we face, right? We know that funding is scarce, costs have increased. We still see opposition at public meetings. That's why we have the abutter law that is being strengthened. We have, I see frequently, inequitable affordable housing. We have implicit biases that are hindering diversity, and we have fair housing testing that shows discrimination. These are things, these aren't new. Right? What else is new, right? These didn't just happen. These didn't happen under any particular administration. These are cultural society patterns that have been in existence for decades. Next slide, please. And when we talk about fair housing, I think that in many ways, resident selection is the field where fair housing is played. Eric spoke about great advances in fair housing at the state level, which is fabulous, and so very welcome to have an office of fair housing. And it's really the day-to-day where people are selected, how people are treated, as they are in their units is really where we see so much of the fair housing. Next slide. And when we talk about fair housing, there's a list of the protected classes, and this is probably just a repeat refresher for everybody. We have the federal fair housing, the federal protected classes on the left, and Massachusetts. Excuse me, ladybug just landed right on me. Is that good luck for everybody, right? Yes, right. And then the Massachusetts adds these other protected classes. And I highlighted familial status and source of income. That's what we'll talk a little bit about. That's what I'm going to highlight today. Again, this is just 10 minutes, so there are many other things we could talk about, but in the interest of time, we're just going to pick those two. Next slide, thank you. And again, the voucher holders, that's source of income. That's really voucher holders, familial status, and then we'll also talk a little bit about local preference or local residence. Next slide. So as we talk about vouchers, I'm going to bring it up a level and talk about affordability. What we've looked at in these 10 areas is really the most affordable rentals. Looking at it from that perspective, we look at the traditional 40B, where they're restricted at the 80%. So you have 25% of the units are restricted at 80% income. Of course, there are other developments. Maybe you have 100% affordable, which is fabulous. You have units that are income driven in terms of their rents. But if we look at this sort of traditional 40B, there are many hundreds and thousands of units that are created in this model. And in fact, 85% of the affordable units in this service area of these 10 communities are in that traditional 40B. And we looked at, because we're in the arena, we have all this information of really looking at we do a lot of monitoring of these units of who's being served. And we find that over a third are actually being leased by people using vouchers. So if we understand that, we say that a third of the units there are being leased by extremely low-income households. And then the other 2/3 are being leased by people at 63% AMI. So I hear a lot when people are local residents are wondering about who's being served with the 80% units, that the rents are too high, and looking for deepening the affordability. So this is just something that I thought was very interesting, that really a third of them are being served for extremely low income people. We also see in this area of the traditional 40B that annual rent increases are often very large. The rent increase process is written into the regulatory agreements, and in the LIP programs, which more and more are the LIP programs with the MBTA zoning and some of the other local zoning, inclusionary zoning processes. These require municipal approval for rent increases. When we work with the municipalities to have a voice in limiting renewal increases, even though the regulatory agreements might allow a greater increase. So I put in here that we've had recent success in limiting renewal increases to 5%. And again, there's a lot of information here, but just wanted to highlight that as a way that different communities and in the field, in the arena, ways that you can influence and try to help the rents in this manner. Next slide, please. So 6 of the communities that we work with are part of the West Metro Home Consortium, which is a group of 13 communities. This is a home consortium where home funds are come through. and are doing some fair housing testing there, administered by the Suffolk Housing Discrimination Program. This is a great group, and I encourage you to reach out to them. They'll do some education if you're interested in that kind of thing, presentations to property managers, municipal boards on fair housing and various kinds of issues around here. And they have found, and they're just finishing up now, that almost 30% of the tests that they have done show evidence of discrimination, and very strong evidence. So almost 20% failed for persons with vouchers, and 10% failed for racial discrimination. And are we surprised? Yes, many people are very surprised. Said, oh, well, that doesn't actually happen here. That really happens, in Boston, or it doesn't happen at all. It would never happen in Metro West. So it's important to do the testing. It's important to publicize that it, in fact, has these results, and it opens the door for education and opportunities for understanding and uncovering and paving the way for greater opportunity. And so they're finishing the testing, and will go on to do reporting where we can have more publicity and outreach around the results. Next slide, please. So on summary, while 1/3 of the tenants use vouchers, they're highly discriminated against, needing, as I mentioned, the continual education and enforcement. It seems to be some property managers are continual showing up there. And the private 40B rental developments do serve lower income tenants. And so those units aren't restricted, and requiring stable and increased funding for vouchers. This remains very important. It's serving a huge need, the 80% units. And advocating for lower rent increases is effective and important. The HUD income limits, they're a couple of years behind in terms of when they publish those, but they're almost 10% every year, and no tenant can afford a 10% raise every year in terms of their rent. And it's important to continue to advocate for limiting those rent increases. Next slide, please. Yes, I think we all recognize this, right? So there they are, the toxic waste of land use, right there, the kids. Next slide. And we do see that. 1-bedroom units predominate. So I had this example of 47% of a recent rental development was 1-bedroom. And then I actually went and looked this morning, and actually there was one that was 68% and another one that was 54%. So even though, and we do understand that that households are getting smaller and people do want to downsize, but 68% of 1-bedroom is an awful lot of 1-bedrooms. The interagency 3-bedroom policy is critical, and it's important out in the field to hold developers to that, and to manage that, and to evaluate the proposals coming to you, that 10% should be 3-bedroom. And larger units are in demand. And I just put some statistics here of some of the recent lotteries, both rental and ownership. So you could just see how many applicants are coming forward for these 3-bedrooms. So on the ownership side, we know that ownership is a wealth builder, but even on the rental side, we have a lot of families looking to, and these aren't only in the Metro West service area. These are around just in general. And next slide, please. So just moving on to local preference, just going through all these topics, right? So what is allowed? Local preference is available only at initial leasing and purchase, up to 70 units rounded down, and it's a fixed set of categories. And what is the effect? Well, local preference units are often undersubscribed. So it really is a political mechanism in many ways. And it has the effect of perpetuating the demographics, as you would expect. And it might be perceived as discriminatory, because if you have a community that has a certain demographic, and 70% of the units are going to be that demographic, So why would you change that? Well, you would change it to remove exclusionary messaging, so that people feel that it's a more open opportunity, and to increase diversity, as well as simplifying the leasing. Because yes, they are often undersubscribed. So even though 70% are reserved for local preference, there are often not enough local applicants. And so what are some options that you could do is to educate boards and decision makers, reduce or eliminate on a project by project basis. And some communities are talking about considering ownership versus rental, one kind of local preference standard for ownership versus rental. And I want to say that some communities have reduced or eliminate local preference altogether. So the conversations are starting and have been going on for a couple of years now, at least in the world that I travel. And next slide. So what can you do? Right. So come in the arena, get in the arena, right? Show up, vote, support local efforts, change the conversation. And again, support the good while working on the perfect. Like, we know it's never going to be perfect. It's never the perfect site. It's never the perfect opportunity, but always support the good. Sometimes we see the experts who aren't working on the projects always want to second guess the people who have been working on things for 3 or 4 years. So sometimes you just have to say, I'm going to support the people who have been working on the project. They're advancing housing, and I'm just going to go and support what they've been doing. But change happens. I've seen this, and I believe this, when the community comes together, when you can bring the different groups together to come to your agenda and support the housing initiatives in your community or your region, or that I think that's when things can happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for challenging us as well to get in the arena and fight the good fight. And thank you for your presentation and your work. I know there's questions coming in the chat. We will have time for those, and I can't wait to dig in more on lots of what you shared. We're going to continue going here. I'm excited to welcome up our next presenter on the panel, Esme Carmelo. She'll be presenting on some of the intricacies, right? We're excited for this to present to some, and certainly to introduce to others. Sorry, it seems like someone just, if you could, everyone could just mute themselves, it would be helpful. And she'll be doing a quick review of some civil rights cases, talking about how affordability sort of intersects with affirmatively furthering for housing, and a broader context of enforcement and addressing discrimination. So Esme, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And thank you so much, Liz, for that really great setting of the table and all of the good information that equips us to get out there and try to do things that are effective and targeting the issues that we have. So I'm Esme Caramello. I direct the Attorney General's new Housing Affordability Unit. The Attorney General just created this unit as Whitney said earlier, the summer of 2024. It's part of her overall effort to focus on affordability and social mobility. And my mandate in setting up this unit is to figure out what is it that the Attorney General and all of the resources that she has here can do about the affordability crisis in housing. And one of the areas in which we might be able to make a difference, or one of the areas in which a difference needs to be made, as has already been alluded to, is this problem of local, of basically creating new housing in places outside of the major cities, outside of the just centers of the major cities. And so the challenges there, of course, are, as you all know probably better than I do, that anytime, when you want to create fair housing, a lot of what you're talking, when you have fair housing goals and equity focus, then a lot of the housing that we need is denser, it's multifamily, it's supportive housing, it's transitional housing. And these are all things that are hard to place outside in cities. They're hard to place at all. And they're certainly hard to place outside of the major cities. So that's a challenge. And what that means is they're hard to place in the sense that anytime you do want to place them, you have to go through a discretionary process Sorry, for some reason, my lights are gonna just keep going out while I'm talking and we're just gonna go with it. So you have to go through a discretionary process. And that discretionary process is gonna involve a lot of public meetings and public comment and time and all of those things. And during that public comment, fears and prejudices are going to get conflated with legitimate municipal concerns like school budgets and traffic. But the fears and prejudices that people maybe even unwittingly experiencing get conflated with those things in the public dialogue. So it could be hard to know what we're even talking about when opposition is coming out, and who's talking about what. And the municipal decision makers, of course, are often not the people who are talking in this dialogue. So you have all of the dialogue, and where you might hear things that are red flags for you if you have a fair housing lens. But then you have municipal boards and the sort of cause and effect between the public dialogue and the decision making of municipal officials can be very difficult to understand, difficult to measure, difficult to understand. And we have the fact, and I'm just laying this all out, and then I'm going to go to some slides about the Fair Housing Act as a tool, potential tool, and just spending my time with you here today, evaluating that one little bit of that one little tool, to see whether it's useful to us in this context. But just to continue laying out the context, again, I suspect everybody knows this, but in these public comment processes, and in these discretionary processes, we are effectively asking towns and cities to open up and to be less exclusionary. And that opening up, well, the exclusion benefits primarily white homeowners who have historically been advantaged in accessing homeownership. And now they have it, and when we eliminate the exclusion, we do take something away. And for many white homeowners, that their home is their primary asset. So that's a real thing. And the studies, the very detailed studies, and I have a slide at the end, which you may see, or you might just be able to see it in the slide deck later, if you go back, has this great book called Neighborhood Defenders, which you can probably see on my shelf back there. You know, that and other research shows that who is it what voices are most often represented in the public dialogue around new projects? It's older white homeowners. And part of that is who lives in the suburbs, who lives outside the major cities. And part of that is who is deeply invested for historical reasons. And again, we don't even have to talk about people's feelings or their politics. This is all about coming together. And I think that, you know, I want to talk a little bit either now or in the panel discussion about how is this, knowing this history, how we got here, this history of racial exclusion, how is that actually useful to us at this point in time? Is it, and how is it? And part of it is just understanding what's going on. Okay, so against that background, I'm going to endeavor to share my screen and put on a PowerPoint all at once while you're all watching me. Here we go. Share screen. And then I have to start this. How's that?
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So, like I said, there's a lot of different ways we can look at this issue. And what I wanted to do today is just examine the Fair Housing Act for a minute and see how it's been attempted to be used as a tool locally recently, and then think about whether that's the right way to go. And if not, what else might be available to us. So just to set the scene, Fair Housing Act of 1968, as amended. This is where it's located in the US Code for all the lawyers and wannabe lawyers out there. And just here's what it says. It says, it shall be unlawful to make unavailable or deny. So make unavailable is usually the term that we're talking about when we're talking about citing, zoning, and citing of housing, permitting. Make available or deny to any person, and these are the protected categories that Liz talked about. This is the federal law: race, color, religion. Of course, I can't see because my screen is very. There we go. Sex, familial status, or national origin, or because of a handicap of a person intending to reside in the dwelling. So who's going to live there? We cannot discriminate on these bases under federal law. And under this federal law, this applies not just to state actors, but it applies to private citizens as well. So the Fair Housing Act applies to everybody, regardless of whether they're a government official. There is an exception, so you see familial status, and Liz hit on that. There is an exception to the familial status. Familial status discrimination usually takes the form, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but it usually takes the form of sort of, we don't want children in this development. We don't want children in our town, or the fears about the school system. Again, you know, legitimate fears about overcrowding of schools. There's an exception because, as we all know, there is housing that is reserved for seniors. So how does that work? And that's because there's an exception, the Housing for Older Persons Act exception, that the familial status discrimination limitation doesn't apply to certain kinds of housing for older persons. Okay. And the next piece of the Fair Housing Act that I want to present is this. It's not only unlawful to make unavailable or deny housing on one of these protected reasons, but it is also unlawful to interfere with somebody who's trying to exercise fair housing rights. And so you see this also when people are litigating a fair housing case. Sometimes they're usually litigating it as both of these things, both making unavailable a dwelling to somebody because of their protected identity, and coercing, intimidating, threatening, or interfering with somebody who's trying to help others to exercise their fair housing rights. So I'm going to talk about three sort of scenarios, three cases, two cases and a bylaw review, where I'm assuming that some of these scenarios will seem somewhat familiar, and I want to say here are situations where, how does the Fair Housing Act apply to this situation? So case number one is a 2010 case. It played out in the federal district court here in Massachusetts. South Middlesex Opportunity Council, which I will hereforward go refer to as SMOC. Everybody I know calls them SMOC. I don't know if they call themselves SMOC, but anyway, I'm going to say SMOC. So SMOC had substance abuse treatment and recovery centers. Substance use disorder, so long as people are not continuing to use substances, unlawful substances, or to abuse them, substance use disorder is a disability protected by the Fair Housing Act and other fair housing laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. So SMOC was serving a population with substance use disorder who were, pursuing sobriety and experiencing sobriety. And they presented this was a summary judgment decision, which just means that the judge found that they had presented enough evidence that a reasonable jury could conclude that the Fair Housing Act was violated. Okay, a reasonable jury could conclude the Fair Housing Act was violated. There was enough evidence. What does enough evidence mean? This is what the judge had. This is what the judge saw. Members of the Select Board of Framingham, again, there's evidence that the members of the Select Board of Framingham, not the Select Board as a whole, but members, had expressed concerns that were sort of red flag concerns. They said, I don't know about these kind of residents living in this place. They expressed that they wanted to stall the project. Both the select and the plan. So that's something where you're looking for comments of elected officials, right? Town officials. If they're making comments that suggest that there might be some discrimination going on, that becomes a kind of evidence that's relevant to the question of whether a Fair Housing Act violation is occurring. The select and planning boards had become involved in decisions that were really not their decisions to make. They were sort of mucking around in parts of city government that weren't really where they normally wouldn't be operating and where they really had no formal role. That was another sign that this was being treated atypically. In the middle, while this proposal is like going through the normal process, the town actually amended its bylaws to make projects like this harder to get through, to impose site plan review to projects like this one, like SMOCs. And then select board members talked about demanding pilot payments. That's the payments in lieu of taxes for nonprofits who don't pay taxes ordinarily, sort of demanding that, and said, oh, if we do this, it'll increase the cost and also deter people in the future from trying to bring this kind of project into our town. Okay, so this is what, there was evidence of these things. And so the judge let the case go to the jury. In doing so, the judge said the following things. One, discrimination under the Fair Housing Act can include, first of all, it totally applies to the zoning context, it applies to the permitting context, and it can include delays in permitting, even where the permits are ultimately issued. If a project is being delayed in part because of discriminatory intent, that can be a violation of Fair Housing Act. Second, I think a key thing that the judge noted here that's useful to us is that, of course, people should be able to express themselves in public processes. That's a really important American value. And residents who show up and, often in town governments, for example, city governments too, people are both citizens with their own personal opinions, and they might be municipal officials in some manner, a member of the planning board who's also just a person living in the town, right? So when residents oppose a project and they're using municipal procedures to express their opposition, like public comment at a planning board meeting or something, they don't run afoul of the Fair Housing Act, except if they're acting in the form of, in their official capacity as town officials. Because if they're just expressing their feelings, they're not denying anybody anything. They're not making housing unavailable. They're expressing their views. But when they're acting as board members or town meeting members, then they can be, then what they say does get evaluated under the Fair Housing Act. And then the third thing, and this is an interesting one, that the decision maker, say the planning board or town meeting, or let's say the planning board chair, need not feel personal animus towards the group. If the purpose of the decision maker is to effectuate the desires of the town's private citizens, and there's evidence that the town's private citizens are being are basing their decisions on discrimination. So what that does is it loops in the public comment period into the analysis of whether what is happening here is discriminatory, if that makes sense. And I'm gonna, just click onto this next slide to elaborate on that. So in this case, the town of Framingham, in defending itself, had said, wait a minute, it's true that we held meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, and that those meetings went on forever and that people talked forever and made discriminatory remarks. But this is, I don't know that the town actually said that, but let's take it as a hypothetical. They had said something along those lines. But what are we supposed to do? Members of the public have the right to come express themselves to us as we're making these decisions. And what the court said is, okay, but you as a municipal official have the power to restrict the kinds of things, maybe not restrict what people say, the kinds of things that are said, but you can restrict how long people speak, how many opportunities people have to speak, how long this public process goes on, because delay, as we all know, makes things more expensive and tends to cause people to walk away and sometimes leads a project not to happen. So town officials may have an obligation to contain public comment in order to move projects along where the public comment is causing delay, undue delay in the project as for discriminatory reasons. Okay, so that's one example. And then I'm going to talk in a second about how we use all of this. Here's just another different kind of example. So that was disability discrimination in the context of a permitting process where the discrimination was against the residents who were going to move into the housing. Here we have Haitian American condo developers, Linda Valentine and her husband, who's not featured in this photo. So they were trying to put a condo project in, and people, and these comments that you see here, which I won't go through in detail, were all comments made by people in the public comment period at all the meetings. And the judge in this case found, similarly, a federal court in Massachusetts found that these comments, again, could support a reasonable juror in finding that there were discriminatory animus on the part of the residents who were opposing this development, that they were biased against the developers. And again, here, what they're looking for is the causal link between the comments that are made at the in the public process and the actual decisions and the actual processes that the town officials are following. So the court here, again, is looking for clues. How do I know that this is that these developers being treated differently? It's one thing for them to be experiencing this hate, and that's not okay. But how do I know that it's actually leading to a fair housing violation? And what they focused on here, as with Framingham, was the evidence of town officials' departures from procedural norms. I mean, 29 meetings, 14 working groups sessions, 16 months, and they compared it to other similar condo developments and said that this is, there was enough for a jury to find that this was race-based. Last but not least, and I'm going to give you a little link to a cool tool here where you can do more fair housing research on your own. So a third context in which we might see these things is family status discrimination. And again, family status is a protected category under the Fair Housing Act, Federal Fair Housing Act. And we often hear I would say almost always, we hear the concern that if you put in multifamily housing, then there will be more children in the schools, and that will put a strain on the schools, and the town will have budget problems because of the strain that it puts on the schools. Or if the town's not going to hire new teachers, then it would put a strain on the children who will have overcrowded classrooms. So this gets raised, and there's a lot of conversation going on about whether that's an appropriate consideration for a town to engage in. Anytime a town, not a city, but a town in Massachusetts changes their bylaws, including their zoning bylaws, it comes to our office, to our municipal law unit, and they review the law to see if it is in compliance with Massachusetts law. And they issue a decision. And all of the decisions are publicly available at this link that I've put here. You can look at them, and there's a search tool, which I've clipped and shown you on the upper left-hand corner. There's a search tool where you can search by topic, and you can search the Fair Housing Act, and it'll pull up all the municipal decisions we've issued. And sometimes those decisions will say, this bylaw is fine. Sometimes they will say, this bylaw is not fine. It violates the fair housing law, and say why. Sometimes they'll say, it's fine, but be careful how you apply it, because here's what the fair housing law says. And so that's a useful source of sort of understanding the way that Fair Housing Act applies in the zoning context. And here's one that we have on family status discrimination that I'm going to wrap up. This is I think a 2023, just a little quote from a 2023 decision, noting that 2 recent land court cases, again, Massachusetts, but these are Massachusetts state cases, have expressed concern where towns and have said it can be, unless there's really a significant impact on the schools, like you can prove, the town can really prove that there's a lot of kids who are pretty likely to come in, and that it's going to overwhelm the schools, that just merely sort of saying, what about the schools, can be an inappropriate and arguably discriminatory basis for denying new housing. So that's what I wanted to say. I was going to talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing. I want to say, A, it's a huge topic. B, I'm not sure what its future is as more than a narrative tool under the new administration. Probably not great, but we shall see. And so before but in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up. But I want to say one thing. I have more. I could sorry, do my tech here, and now I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Okay. So what I want to say is, I'm interested in further conversations with anyone and everyone here about, I don't love the idea of us all running around suing each other or like looking for proof that people are doing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. And so what do we do when we sense that something is amiss, that the conversation that's happening, that the reason something is getting held up, the reason something is getting delayed are discriminatory? How do we use the Fair Housing Act in conversation, in community? How do we use it as a tool? Is it just a litigation tool, or can it be used in other ways? And also that history that I talked about. I think there are just a lot of good people in all of our cities and towns who don't know that history. And to the extent that we, as people who, well, I'll just say, and to the extent that people who want to build multifamily, supportive, transitional housing, denser housing, missing middle housing in our towns, I live in Cambridge, but to the extent, to spread this housing across the state, if we can learn about the overarching story of structural racism and also the granular detail, that granular detail for your locality is available in many cases. And just to understand how we got where we were, ultimately, these public conversations are often about fairness. They're often about why is it fair for our town to absorb this new housing and the increased costs that may come along with it. And I think just a crucial part of that fairness conversation is understanding how we got to look the way that we do. And the more that we can become fluent in that, the more we can have these conversations with our neighbors that change hearts and minds. So that's my thinking, but I'm interested in hearing from all of you. Okay.
Thanks so much, Esme, for framing us in changing hearts and minds, understanding that deep history and how we are looking forward and leaning in on this legal landscape. I know I was taking active notes here, really about what tools we have at our disposal, what case law we can lean on, and what's compliant and appropriate in municipal decision making. Is amazing. I know there's lots of questions. Keep them coming in the chat, and thank you to our colleagues who have been responding and panelists who have been responding to some of those questions already. So now we're going to hear from the developer voice. I'm going to invite Matt Rabania from Boston Communities to join us to talk about what gets built and how it gets implemented from a fair housing perspective of where things are produced and what actually gets produced. So welcome, Matt.
Awesome. Thank you, Whitney. And thank you to Isme and to Liz for the really great presentations and really setting up, what I'm about to talk about. And I'll try to keep my comments somewhat brief because I know folks have a lot of questions and definitely want to get to the Q&A. So my name is Matt Rabina. I'm a principal with Boston Communities, and we're really a practitioner. So we're a developer of affordable housing with a concentration on both affordable rental and affordable home ownership housing. We're a small emerging developer. We were founded in 2021 by my partners, Phil Cohen and Marie Morissette. And we're a small minority owned developer. We, in the 3 years since we've been around, and actually if you want to go to the next slide, in the 3 years since we've been around, we really got our start both, first as consultants for other developers and then joint venturing with other developers. And we are now at the point where we're closing on our first Boston Communities solo project. We're really out on our own, building 25 units of affordable home ownership here in Dorchester through the Mayor's Office of Housing, through the Welcome Home Boston program. And though we primarily work in the Boston area, we are statewide and are actually working on our first project in Connecticut as well right now. Up there, this is our mission statement. So we're a team of advocates and developers working to bring in the next generation of real estate firms by building mixed income, transit-oriented, and environmentally sustainable communities that strengthen neighborhoods and increase economic mobility. A lot of these points, which really tie to the fair housing conversation that we're having here today. Go to the next slide, just to highlight some of the priorities we look for as we're putting forth new projects and thinking about new development sites. So we prioritize affordability, and affordability is at all income levels. Generational wealth creation, which I'll talk a little bit more about and why that's important to us and why I think that really ought to be part of the fair housing conversation. Sustainability, transit forward, transit oriented, minimizing car-oriented development. Family-sized units were appropriate. I saw some folks in the chat talking about some communities really wanting smaller unit sizes, and we believe in that too, where it's appropriate, and really putting forth community-focused proposals that are really responsive to what the needs are in those communities and also designed in the context of those communities. So there's two things that I would like to focus on, partially focused on, if you go to the next slide. So the first thing is the where of where we develop housing. And as practitioners, I think we have a fairly small role in terms of what it means to advance fair housing, but there is some significance in terms of where we choose to site new projects, and especially as developers of affordable housing. The kind of housing that we're developing is accessible to a lot of people who might not otherwise be able to move to certain communities. The risk that we run as a small emerging developer is we are looking for opportunities where there is lower risk. We want to take on sites that we know are going to be well received, that we're working in communities that want us to be there, and that we're working in communities where there are champions who want to be able to move affordable projects forward. Isme just spent a lot of time highlighting the complicated where things don't go right, where developers have gotten caught in the legal system because of various local boards, butters who might not want them there and are using the legal system as the tool to help these developments. And as a small developer, we're not capitalized to take on those kinds of legal battles as much as we may believe, like, hey, housing belongs everywhere and we should be developing everywhere. The reality is we're going to develop where we think we can actually get something done. And especially in a place like Massachusetts or in the Boston area where the cost of housing is through the roof, we feel that any kind of housing we could develop anywhere in the area is really important in terms of meeting the supply imbalance that we currently have. That said, if you go to the next slide, I do want to highlight, and I know a lot of the folks on this in this meeting are leaders at the municipal level, and are wondering what they could do in terms of making communities more welcoming to developers, to build more housing of all kinds. I really want to highlight the city of Cambridge, who a few years ago passed an overlay which allows by right affordable housing throughout the entire city. In a former life, I was with Wind Development for many years, and permitted a project under the AHO, as it's colloquially known, that was a controversial project. And Cambridge, despite the fact that it is a very progressive city and generally is very welcoming to new types of affordable housing development, it's certainly not without its NIMBYism. And I really have to give some credit to the city of Cambridge, because the affordable housing overlay really became this mechanism that allowed what was otherwise a fairly controversial project to move forward, and now is permitted for 100% affordable units in a transit-oriented location with minimal new car parking spaces added. And that's not to say that that lengthy process, even without its opponents, didn't add complexity and cost to the project. It's certainly not a done deal yet, but at least the local piece and the permitting piece was not the obstacle that would prevent this project to move forward. And now wearing my Boston Communities hat again, Cambridge is one of the cities that we're really looking to do more work in, because we know there is that certainty around being able to permit projects and move it forward. And Cambridge, by a lot of metrics, is the kind of place where we want to develop more affordable housing in terms of its high quality school systems, its access to transit, its proximity to jobs, proximity to amenities, open space, green space, you name it. It really is a desirable location. And the fact that the city is really prioritizing this kind of affordable development and really broadening opportunities for people at all income levels to move there is really fantastic. And stay tuned, and hopefully Boston Communities will have more on work in Cambridge soon. And then the next slide, I also want to focus a little bit about the what kinds of housing we're developing. And a lot of fair housing conversations, at least the ones that I've been a part of, have really revolved around access to rental housing, which is a completely valid thing. One of the key principles at Boston Communities that we focus on is also helping families and households build equity. All of us, me and my two partners are all immigrants or come from immigrant families. And so we've personally seen how important it is for home ownership to be a part of building generational wealth and passing that along to your to your children and your grandchildren, and letting that be a launching point for successful lives. And so we really think it's also just important to make sure that we're creating opportunities for home ownership and affordable home ownership. And I really have to applaud the Commonwealth. In the past few years, the Commonwealth Builder Program through Mass Housing has been, we think, a huge success. The city of Boston has really doubled down on that by offering surplus land for that kind of development. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the projects that we're currently working on. So if you go to the next slide, if you go to the next slide, this project, Welcome Home Boston project, which is part of Mayor Wu's larger initiative to use surplus city land for affordable home ownership projects using the last bits of ARPA money that they have. We're in the process of closing on construction financing for 25 new homeownership units in Dorchester in 3 separate buildings. You see the 3 separate buildings here located on Harvard Street. This is a 15-minute walk from the Shawmut T-stop on the Red Line. And the units are going to be sold between $270,000 and $350,000, which in the city of Boston is unheard of. I mean, market condos don't go for anything less than $500,000, if that. And so this lowers that barrier to entry for people who may be looking to purchase and who want to stay in their communities, right? I think a lot of the fair housing conversations revolve around being able to expand opportunity locationally. We also think it's just important to expand the types of housing opportunities in the communities that people already live and may want to stay in. If you go to the next slide, we're also part of the larger development of the Olmsted Village and Olmsted Green sites in Mattapan, where we're in the partners in the development of 91 mixed income and affordable home ownership units, which are the buildings located in blue over several buildings. This is a multi-phase, multi-partner project. This is one that really has taken a village to move forward in partnership with the New Boston Fund, Lena Park CDC, and Two Life Communities. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Whitney for some Q&A, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's so good to have a developer voice at the table. I actually want to invite everyone up. If we can invite everyone on screen, and I appreciate my colleagues who have been in the chat already answering many of the questions. We have Becca, George, and Phil DeMartino from HLC who have been answering lots of the questions, and Liz, many of the panelists already answering some of the questions. So thank you for that. I want to jump right in, and feel free. And this question I'll pose to everyone, sort of wearing your different hats and your scope. What's helpful, right? What's helpful to communities, to municipalities to ensure that housing opportunities are equitable and that there is access, right? What are some of the tools? What's necessary for us to do that? Liz, do you want to start?
Sure, of course. So I think that looking at the housing, looking actually at the floor plans, like where are the affordable people parking, where they're doing their laundry, like where is that compared to the market rate? Like someone has to do that before it's all locked up. Like sometimes when I get involved, it's like locked. It's already done, and like, no, we can't be changing it and stuff. Like on the rental, it's pretty easy because it's you know, like it's a floating kind of situation and all that. But on the home ownership, when you're buying that unit, like it's not like that. Like the laundry is all different, or the closets, especially the closets, are always different. And you know, like some of those, you know, livability kinds of things are really important to actually look at. Like someone to be. I always feel like I'm the owner at the table before they've been selected. Like someone's going to be at the table looking at it from the owner's perspective. So someone to take that role, and it could be anyone. So there's that side. And then there's the outreach, making sure that more than the boards, like who knows that this housing opportunity exists besides Navigator and the thing, you know, like My Mass Home, and, you know, like get the word out. Like there's never enough outreach, right? Like that's always the last thing. It's always hard to do outreach. It's hard to get people at the meetings and all like that. That's always the hardest part. But having like good outreach is really important.
So true. Never enough work to get it right? But also important work. Esme, I'm interested in your thoughts here as well, just in terms of like what's helpful to communities, even from a legal perspective. We talked about some of the tools and leaning upon some of that case law, right, to understand all of this. But what do you think is necessary to ensure housing opportunities are equitable and that there's access?
Yeah, I mean, to build, obviously, big question. So the
Yeah.
caveat is I'll just say something and then they could go on forever. But just to build to some extent on what Liz was saying, that when we think about housing affordability, of course, we want to think not just about what is the median, this median number, but does every single person in Massachusetts have access to the kind of housing that they need, ideally in a community of their choice. And if we keep our eye on that goal, then we are asking ourselves a different set of questions than just how many units, what's the shortage, and all of that. So I think that's one thing that I'm trying to keep as a value for myself here. And then just, you know, I think the other thing I would just say is that, just to reiterate, that I think that sometimes knowing the legal rules can help us talk to one another.
Yeah.
That we're not having arguments that ultimately don't have any significance as a legal matter. And so, you know, I'll give an example. I think Caitlin Golden from HASA posted in the chat about the Dover Amendment. I started to put the Dover Amendment slide up, but so the Dover Amendment is part of the Zoning Act. It's the Zoning Act is Chapter 40A of the General Laws for the law nerds, and Section 3 is the Dover Amendment. So, you know, there's, for example, a section in, you know, there's a paragraph in there that says that municipalities cannot restrict, for example, a church or a religious organization or an educational organization using its property for religious and educational uses. So that means that a religious and an educational use of land doesn't have to go through, as a matter of law, does not have to go through the same level of discretionary local process that other kinds of projects do. But understanding but those categories are so broad. What is a religious use of land? I mean, it can be, housing can be a religious use of land by a church for sure. And different kinds of housing, supportive housing, transitional housing, can be primarily educational. They can be primarily sort of, you're here, I want to give you all of the supports that you can have to get here and be able to stay there, here where you want to be and be able to stay there. And in the meantime, you're going to be housed, for example, an EA shelter, or again, transitional housing for people coming out of incarceration, or people,
Right.
you know, recovering from substance abuse, etc. So those processes should be much faster, which also means cheaper and also means they get done. But it's not clear necessarily. A, people in town don't know that necessarily. B, even understanding what the process, but not every developer knows even how to use those, or whether, when and whether they're appropriate. And C, even when those two things are true, there's still this question of like, okay, now we have a Dover Amendment project, how do we even process it through the town? So bringing, even just bringing, this is my argument for bringing legal education to all, can help us move through these processes more smoothly and with less conflict. Just because we all know the same set of rules. And so, you know, again, like, I think we have a lot of work to do there. And I think it's like it's my responsibility to play a big role in doing it. But I encourage us all to come together on that as well.
We love that. I think it's important for us to come together, use all our tools at our disposal, right, to address these issues. Matt, interested in your thoughts here.
Yeah, and I think both Liz and Ismi touched on some of this during their presentations, but I think, you know, from our perspective, really it's like two things, right? One is I spend a lot of time thinking about land use, clearly, and you know, and I think just knowing that, you know, in terms of the municipal level, and I think the MBTA Communities Act has really pushed a lot of communities in this direction already, and I think, you know, the development community is still like fully absorbing like what the impacts of that are going to be over time, and just making sure that it is creating opportunities for the kinds of housing that we can build on a pro forma, right? Because it's not just, you know, I think there's what does a land use let you do, and then what's like economically supportable, and those two things don't always line up. But I think we're starting to get closer to that. There is more quantity of housing or land, I should say, available for the kinds of housing that is economically viable to build. So I think, you know, if municipalities really want to see more housing development and housing of all types of development, and they're not seeing it, I think they really need to start looking at like what their underlying land use regulations are, and having conversations with developers about like where are the pieces of land that do make sense for development, and why aren't those pieces of land being looked at for development. Even though 40B does really serve as a good tool for us developers to be able to move those conversations forward, even if municipalities aren't ready for those conversations. And then the other piece is we really haven't spent a lot of time talking about resources, right? And especially as we're talking about the development of affordable housing, it is resource intensive. The cost to develop housing has increased dramatically since 2020. We're looking at 30 to 40% higher costs than we had a few years ago. And I think and prices are sticky, right? We're not going to see prices come back down. I think, even today, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. Are there going to be new tariffs that are going to further increase the cost to develop, like we saw back in 2016, 2017? And so access to resources is really important. And so to the extent communities have resources at their disposal that can help bring affordable housing, a lot of communities, of course, have tapped into CPA or have developed their own local trusts. I think that's important. I think one of the things that Liz said that really struck me was, some communities they don't like this idea of affordable rental housing, but they're really open to the idea of affordable home ownership housing or some type of home ownership housing. But there is just kind of this resource misalignment where the resources for affordable home ownership don't necessarily exist in some of the communities we would want to be developing in. And so to the extent that, communities themselves want to put up those resources to buy down the cost of that development so we can sell things at an affordable price point, that 270 to 350 range I was talking about in the city of Boston, that's made possible because the city of Boston and Mass Housing are contributing close to $300,000 a unit in subsidy to buy the cost down. So just something to keep in mind as people are making decisions at the local level.
Great point. Aligning the vision with resources, right? So good. I want to ask this question specific to you, Liz. In my past life, as you mentioned, Matt, I used to run a head of testing program, was a testing coordinator. So I'm fascinated with the testing that you all have helped do. Tell me a little bit more about the renters using vouchers. Why do you think there's such discrimination when they represent a full 1/3 of the renters?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking about that. I think first of all, if 1/3 of the renters are using vouchers, you just have a bigger number. So you're going to have, if you have a certain amount of discrimination, you're going to have more discrimination. And I wanted to clarify that there's so many renters in the 40B affordable units using vouchers because the vouchers pay what is called the fair market rent, which is set by HUD, which in the Metro West area really almost equates to the affordable rent. It's not really, they call it a fair market rent, but it's really not a market rent in the property, the communities where we look, it's really the affordable rent. So that you couldn't use it for market rate rentals. I think it's really because there are so many being used. It's also, I think there's a big education problem. People are confused about the vouchers, and then the vouchers come with all this paperwork, so like there's delay, and they come like the inspection is always a barrier. Sometimes we've seen people were like, well, it's not going to pass inspection. So, a little bit maybe there's some issues there that they don't want to do, or maybe it's just to get the inspectors there. And, we're working on one unit and we have this third party, and 5 weeks it's taking to get the inspectors there. So that just increases the vacancy, right? They just, the property manager wants to turn over the unit quickly. So, because we thought, of course, the voucher is going to pay quickly and it's going to pay routinely. You're not going to have the same delinquency or late.
Imagine that.
Yes, but so I think there's education, there's process delay, and there's just more people with vouchers, so you're going to have more cases of discrimination. But I think it's it's consistent. I think that Suffolk did a significant testing effort some number of years ago, when Boston did a report, I think maybe 5 years ago or something, and it's really about the same. So it hasn't really changed. That needle hasn't moved, and they did different communities, and so it's really the same in these communities. So it's really something that we need to work on, you know, in terms of knowing it exists. Really, I think that's really what it is, and so we can hit it head on.
That's right. I mean, everyone is a member of a protected class, right? And so how do we move the needle? So this question is to you, Esme. Are there laws other than the Fair Housing Act and anti-discrimination laws? I think you alluded to it just now, a little bit, that help pave the way for equity promoting projects like supportive housing or housing for returning citizens? Good to hear your thoughts on that.
I just put in the chat how to file a civil rights complaint, which just, you know, because part of voucher discrimination is like knowing what to do if you see it. So, you know, and I think, Whitney, the answer to that in part is the Dover Amendment, which is not a fair housing law, right? It's a law that is aimed at protecting certain uses that the state has deemed really important. And in some ways, that when we look for laws like that that aren't explicitly about protected classes, we can sometimes reduce the defensive-ness of, because it can be hard to have conversations about civil rights and civil rights violations, and it can sometimes reduce all of that and achieve similar purposes. And I would also mention, and I don't have it handy, but also in that same part of the general laws in the Zoning Act 40A, Section 3, which is where the Dover Amendment is, there's also a prohibition on discrimination against housing for people with disabilities. So that's not in the Fair Housing Act. It's right there in Massachusetts's sort of laundry list of these are really important protected uses. So again, you know, figuring out how to use laws that exist in the context other than litigation, I think, is one of the most interesting challenges. And part of that is just having them at the ready in our conversations.
I would have to agree. And I guess my other question to you is, like, if folks here, how can folks learn more about the history of de jure discrimination and exclusionary zoning relevant to their specific communities? And why do you think that history is so useful?
Yeah. So where you can learn about it. So first of all, I do want to, I put a slide in the slide deck, which I didn't get to, and I'm not going to take the time to start sharing again, but I do want to say it's in the slides, which I know are going to be shared, with a few book recommendations. One of them is, and probably you've all heard of The Color of Law, but it also read it, because it does give you the foundation for understand, you know, again, it gives us sort of like those little bits of information that can be really compelling in the conversations that we're having, and also in understanding what's happening and why it's happening. Like, to your question to Liz, like, why is this happening? Why is it playing out this way? It doesn't, why? And that it helps us to understand why. Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, has also written a book
Just action.
called Just Action, which has like things you can do in it. All right. But in terms of local, really understanding how locally Massachusetts has played at how we've gotten to where we are. Amy Dane is an independent researcher. She's done a lot of really fantastic work on zoning and yes, Joshua Dickens, I agree. Amy has a report, in case you don't want to buy these two books. Amy has a report called Exclusionary by Design, which was published by the Boston Indicators, which is basically the Boston Foundation's research arm. And that's available for free online. It's on my slide. That's a great thing to read to understand, because she's really focusing on the greater Boston area and goes through the history of zoning, which started in basically the 1920s It didn't like come over on the Mayflower, we haven't had zoning since the beginning of time, the Garden of Eden, but no, like 1920, we started doing this, and then we were doing it, and then all of a sudden in 1968, between 1968 and 1975, we had a huge slew of exclusionary zoning. So that's a really potent period. When you look at Amy's research, so that she sort of documents this in great detail, and she calls it the big down zone. 1968, you might recognize that date because I just talked about it. It's when the Fair Housing Act was passed. The Fair Housing Act was passed right after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Boston was in the middle of its busing crisis history, and all the racial unrest around that and the violence. And all of a sudden, we see the area around Boston going large single family large lots, single family houses, etc. And when you look at that combined with the history from Color of Law, it just equips us to, again, I think I said before, but to discuss the question of fairness and why it's appropriate for localities to open up their zoning or to open up their permitting to allow more people in who might not already be members of the town. And, it just helps us all understand why that's the right thing to do.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to bring that into the conversation, particularly as you highlight that, right? Thinking about that history and what and how gets built and where in exclusionary zoning. But my question to you, Matt, you identified fair housing in the frame of what gets built and where it gets built as crucial in thinking about housing development, right? From this fair housing lens, what is necessary as you think about it to ensure that every community is a community of opportunity? What should we be
Yeah.
thinking? Yeah.
No, that's a fantastic question. I get to put my urban planner hat on for this one. Because it's the who too, right? And it's who are we building for? Where do they want to live? I think we've talked a lot about like creating housing opportunities for many different types of people who have many different types of needs, right? And so of course, like the single family house doesn't suit a lot of people, right? And so it's in terms of like what creates a community of opportunity, it's really a community that people want to be in. It's that people have the choice to live where they want to live, and having access to all the things that come from living in a area of opportunity, whatever that might mean to a person. So access to employment, access to transit, good school systems if they have school-age children, access to food, healthcare, amenities, and so I think it's important that we create well-rounded communities. Obviously, we really care a lot about the ability for housing to get developed, but at the same time, it's just as important that communities are balancing that need with everything else, development of open space and again, not to like just talk about money all the time, but it really does come down to resources, right? And make sure communities have the resources in order to build those well-rounded communities, because a lot of people want that, right? A lot of people want these the communities with all these different things, and it does take time and resources in order to build it, and just making sure communities have those resources to do that.
I love it. Complete communities where people can thrive, right? Imagine that. Another point, speaking of thriving, you talk a little bit in your presentation around Boston communities focus on really like generational wealth building and homeownership. And I wonder, question for you, like what do you see are some of the barriers for accomplishing this from your experience? And why do you see it as sort of vital in terms of what you're able to develop and what your goals are in doing so?
Yeah, I think there's, I've talked about some of this already, but I guess just to change it a little bit, it's, I think also people knowing that these opportunities exist, and that's something that, we think a lot about in terms of, making sure that the people who are accessing these first-time homeownership opportunities, that there is a real strong focus on communities of color and people who are first-time home buyers who may not have access to some of that generational wealth already. In the, a lot of the homeownership work we do is in the city of Boston, and the city of Boston, I think, has done a really good job of creating this ecosystem for first-time home buyers through their Fair Housing Center, where there's a group of developers working on these homeownership projects, and they've centralized kind of where how the marketing happens, where the Boston Fair Housing Center is helping and being a participant in terms of hosting workshops, getting people into the pipeline who might want to apply for one of these homeownership opportunities, helping them secure first-time home buyer down payment assistance, helping them find the appropriate mortgage. And so I think the city has really been a great partner in terms of creating those opportunities and making sure that there is a robust pipeline of people who really fit into this opportunity. And so, that's something else that I think some of the municipal folks can take away is like, how can they serve as a resource in order to help, the developers find the people in the community who would benefit from this kind of thing.
It's so good. I know there was a few questions that came from the audience, which I'll get to in a moment around those lines as well. But I want to throw this question over to Liz before I open it up and then turn it back over to Carol. How can people, maybe not in the field or in the field, make a difference and help to influence change? How do we get in the arena as you post it?
I think we've talked about a few things. I think just, paying attention, being educated, knowing what housing projects are going on in the community, knowing what housing legislation might be affecting the community, knowing, sometimes people are more interested in local kinds of things or regional or state, right? Like everyone can sort of pick the playing field like that they're interested in learning about, but I think just being educated is the first step. And joining some coalition of something, and education usually then translates into some kind of action. But showing up and voting, the opponents always come. They always come. And so the supporters don't really come, right? That's the way it always goes. So, and I just wanted to say one thing that Matt brought up, and that's come up a few times. So when we build housing and we think about who it's going to be for, we always are thinking about the people who are in the community that the housing's being built for. But it's really hard to imagine because we're really building housing for the people who are not actually in the community now. And we don't know where they are. We don't know what community they're coming from. We don't know really where they are. We don't know like how far away they're coming or this. Are they in the next community? Are they here? Are they there? So it's very hard to sort of predict what they want because they're not here now. We can measure and track and do needs assessments all about the people who we know because they're in the community now. But that's not actually who we're building the housing for exclusively. We're building it for people who are coming into the community. So you just don't know, right? There's a big element of just building it for they will come, and who they are, you don't know what size of household or needs or this or that. So there is that element. So it's just always to be aware of that part.
Certainly a challenge, but also an opportunity to lean in and to go to the people and hear, right? So appreciate that. I see some questions in the chat, and then I know we're close to time, so I'll be passing it over to Carol. Do I have time for one or two questions, Carol, from the chat? Great. This one is directed to you, Esme. Could a community be in violation of the Fair Housing Act if to control growth, they decide to rezone the whole community to a minimum lot size of 40,000 square feet?
Well, I probably can't comment on,
It depends.
on that, but I mean, you could
Right.
certainly think about an argument on that. But I probably can't comment on a specific scenario. It's very fact specific, and also just give my position here. But I guess you would be looking for the same kinds of things that I was highlighting in that scenario, like why. What's the why? What are the clues as to the why those decisions are being made? And how much is the public dialogue influencing the official decisions? And how much are public officials saying things? And, then you get more of an answer to that. I do want to say, can I say one just quick thing, which is that we haven't talked much, Matt mentioned really importantly, resources. I just want to highlight that preservation is much cheaper and easier than production in so many instances. And it also so often is keeping people in homes that they love, to the important point again that Matt made about not like also creating housing in cities where people are, or in neighborhoods where people are already living and they don't want to leave, and making sure that they have places to go and downsize or something that they can afford in their own communities. So we haven't focused a lot on that. And I just want to put it there as an important piece of all of this anti-displacement work.
Super important, right? And with production and preservation and all of this, like making sure people are first, right? As we think about how we address these goals. There was another question, and I'm not sure if it got answered in the chat that I saw a little earlier, about why aren't all housing authorities sort of required to participate in the FSS family self-sufficiency programs? And what about how regionalizing has had an impact on upward mobility? She mentions it seems to be a barrier that has grown taller with regionalizing housing authorities who also say they can't port out vouchers for the purpose of FSS programs. Any thoughts on that? And we may have to follow up with you, Gwen, on that question. I think it's a larger question around, I think the goal to really uplift more opportunities for homeownership for voucher holders, but appreciate the question. And then I think I see one last one here in the chat from Laura. Would a max number of unrelated adults in a zoning definition of family be a violation of fair housing?
Yeah, I'm probably going to give the same answer, which is like, I probably can't opine on the question, but I do think that that's probably the tool that I offered the municipal law unit decisions, because we do see that sometimes in zoning. And so if you're curious at all about, I've seen this in zoning, or I've seen this in proposed zoning, or I'm worried this is going to come into zoning, you can look through that database and you can start with fair housing, the fair housing topic, and you can look through decisions and you'll find language where our municipal law unit has opined on whether things do or do not violate the fair housing laws. And I know that's something that's come up in the past.
That's great. And that's a huge tool and a great starting point as folks are out in the field and community on the local level to have at their disposal. So thank you as being for providing that for us here. I just want to thank the full panel. It has been a pleasure to both in the planning and in conversation with you today. Thank you, Matt, Liz, and Esme. Truly appreciate not only your work, but your valued contributions to today's second session of the panel of the forum. And I'll turn it back over to Carol Marine. And I hope folks will join me in a virtual applause for all of our panelists, as well as to Carol for putting this forum together each year in the full home ownership team. It's been 20 plus years and putting this together, it's sort of been reimagined over time, and it's not lost on me. It's not easy putting these sorts of things together. So thanks so much, everyone on the panel, and thanks, Carol.
Well, back at you, Whitney, and thanks to my talented moderator colleague, Whitney, for moderating a great discussion. Of course, thanks to Liz, Matt, and Esme for not only identifying issues in fair housing, but showing us solutions. As Rachel said way back earlier, one thing that CHAPA prides itself on doing is developing and educating the field. And I think with speakers like you and your perspectives on specifics on how to solve these problems is very useful. So thank you all. I have posted a very brief survey in the chat. Hopefully you can fill it out. It's 4 questions. And I just want to tell you, please come back November 13th, next Wednesday at 3 for our final session. And that will be on, we will address how to incorporate affordability with inclusionary zoning. We'll have an opening welcome from Andrea Aldana as the Chief Program Officer, Office of Community Development Partnership on the Cape. Katie Lacey will moderate a discussion That will include Dave Cashman of SEB Housing, Matt Latanzi, Director of Planning and Development for the City of Revere, Ali Sabatino, a housing specialist at EOHLC, and Alexis Smith, who's a principal regional housing and land use planner. And I bet somebody put that, there's a link on our website, and I will post that in a second. Of course, please stay involved with CHAPA. We can advocate better together. Please join our committees, join our young professionals network. Please generously support our work, and please speak up at the local and regional level so we can assure fair housing for all. I will put next week's session in the chat, and I hope to see you all next week. Actually, Whitney just did. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.